Things first, welcome and welcome to our latest Guidebook Meets. I'm Nathan, I'm the event and community manager here at Guidebook, and we do want to hear from you all. So do feel free to let us know where you're joining us from in the chat, but also you can use that as a way to pop your questions in, and we'll be able to take those either during or at the end of today's session. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Felicia Chanco, the Director of Special Initiatives at the Asian American Journalists Association. Felicia has a huge amount of experience operating in the event planning and association markets. And I'm excited that today we're going to be talking about a host of things, but really centering the conversation around events, community, and connection. So, Felicia, firstly, thank you for joining us. And I wanted to just kick things off with a little bit of an overview of the Asian American Journalists Association mission and how your events align with this mission to foster community, careers, connection for your over 2,000 members.
Yeah, well, I first want to say thank you so much for having me, Nathan. And, I really do appreciate Guidebook as a tool as we do go through our events. So I'll try not to overhype Guidebook as we go through this process. But to first start off with AAJA, so we're the Asian American Journalists Association. We support journalists as well as the ecosystem to allow for better reporting and more inclusive reporting of stories of our communities. So we see this, again, like about 2,000 members. And I would say I use the word ecosystem specifically because it's those who we affect is actually much larger than our actual members base. So as we go through events, and I know you'll have some follow-up questions around this, our important thing here is to really make sure that we're connecting at these different touch points as people approach this space. Not only are journalists, and I'll talk about them in length, but also like how are we connecting them with resources such as community centers, community resources, let's say even like corporate media, newsrooms. All of these different things are kind of signal points of the success how our events are, our ability to kind of encapsulate everyone, make sure everyone has that good experience, so those connections are able to be made amongst our ecosystem.
Yeah, no, that's a great overview, and I appreciate that. And I know we're gonna dig into a lot of different components today, and I guess firstly, you have, I think, is it 20 chapters that AAJA covers?
That's
And
correct.
I guess like when you're thinking about the events that you operate, and I'm sure a lot of associations face this challenge, how do you ensure that the events are tailored to the needs of such a diverse and kind of geographically spread out group?
Yeah, so I like yes, very much geographically diverse, but also like the diversity within the membership themselves. I mean, like I'll start with like kind of like ethnic identity. Like the AAPI community is made of many communities, excuse me. So, we're talking about like 50 different ethnicities, more than that, like many different languages, at least, and many different types of history, especially as, we talk about the dynamics of like Asia to America, the diaspora. So like all of that in of itself is already very nuanced. On top of that, as well, there is the nuance or the complexities that is like the different style of journalists there are too. So, we're looking at, like, for example, photojournalists versus your investigative reporters versus someone who works specifically in video and audio. So, to kind of like that was kind of an overview or like a quick high level, like all the different types of folks we'll have. But I think the way that we're able to really incorporate the different types of interests, at least programmatically, is that we do have a function called excuse me, a function that we use is called the suggestion programming inbox, basically, where we allow for the membership to inform our programming. It's a way for us to allow them to, to show us like what they're interested in, what really matters to them, not only as what they're covering, but also their experience within, as a journalist, either within their newsrooms or a freelancer or whatever it may be. So those are the types of things that we like want to capture, like not only the quantity of what is being asked to be covered in our programming, but also like the quality of this as well. I would say, like how are we capturing like language and words that specifically are important to our groups? So, we see this a lot, for example, in different coverages, currently this administration, immigration, like are like two things that like really came out of our suggestion box. But I suppose that's like something that like from there we we work with different committees to like kind of digest that. And that's the type of relationship that like us as producers of the overall event, we want to have that touch point with our members and like, trusted people in a committee to like support that overall.
And do you find that all those different groups do engage with you in terms of sharing their needs? How do you go about collecting that data? And, do some groups kind of willingly engage a little bit easier than others?
That's a great question to raise. I'll use the chapters for an example. Our chapters, yes, we have many, but like there are, I would say, like three major chapters that have like a lot of active members. And I think you could probably figure out, they're coastal based. But I think the opportunity here for us is that we do try to, or we like attempt to make a standardization of how we are reaching out to all the groups. For example, there are 20 chapters. There is an email or there is a mechanism from like our membership as well as our board members as well as our staff that will reach out to these groups to be like, we have this process open. We want to make sure that we're engaging y'all to give us that information that you want, like if you had programming that you would like. And so I think like just making that extra effort to like have that touch point with these different groups really does make the difference. I suppose that the way I would like kind of describe it is like there's the general, and then there's like, oh, we acknowledge people's leadership, people's willingness to be more active in these ways. So we call it like showing them the front door. Like, here's the front door of how to get your programming, or here's how your front door of like how to stay in touch with us so that we are facilitating this conversation.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. That's really good insight and useful to know. And I'm curious as well, thinking about the way in which you design and approach your events. And events are always made by a team of people, and I'm interested to learn a little bit more about your leadership team and how that leadership team influences the way in which you do design and approach events, and especially when it comes to creating inclusive environments and thinking about accessibility. Like, what's the approach there by your team?
Yeah, I think the way that I've been describing it is like, it's very hard to look at, historically we have about 1,500 attendees, right? It's hard to like kind of treat that 1,500 as a cohesive one, So I think the way that we can really instill like the need to like be mindful of people first is to know that these are 1,500 individuals. Not to say that each person will get like the one-to-one experience of like talking to me, as the executive producer for it. But at the very least, like what I call it is called segmentation lists. Like how can we look at these different types of groups and like what are their needs or what are their goals and what would they like to experience like on and convention themselves. So to talk a little bit about the leadership. So, I'm proud to say that most of our team is made of Asian women. We have Asian staff as a whole. And so, this is something that like we don't see a lot of makeups like this, where the leadership is so strongly like led by women leaders. I'm glad to like be able to be part of a team like this, because I think there is like a dynamic that we're able to facilitate from the beginning of this process, we're all the way through, where it just feels more like collaborative and like we are trying to be understanding of our membership and and of our attendees. I think there was another question around accessibility.
Mm.
I think that's another thing that is a big thing. Like not only like how do people physically get to this space, but also are we making the experience that we want people to have accessible as well? So, one thing I like to lead with is, for example, technology and tools. How are we making these things that we are saying has like this robust information, it is the guide to how like people would like go to this convention. How are we making it accessible to different levels of tech literacy, if you will? So part of it is, I think, like creating the resources to actually be off of tech too. Like, do people know where to reach out if they needed, if they had questions about a specific program, if they had a specific like lens as they go into the convention with me, my teammates, my volunteers, my, basically the info desk, if you will. Like, are we all prepared to be able to help people and navigate them and point them to the right way? So luckily, oftentimes it's just like, oh, do you have Guidebook? Or like, this is where you can find it on Guidebook, But also it's like, I feel like we do need to take the time to be mindful of different levels of literacy. And I do think especially with the older generation, and I know for myself too, I love a good printout too. So like, we'll have some on site, we'll try to make it accessible in these different ways. But yeah, that's like kind of like where I would share about that.
Yeah, no, that's really useful. And I feel, you sort of did mention Guidebook there, but I'm also curious away from Guidebook. Are there any strategies that you do utilize that kind of help ensure all members feel involved? Whether that's from, a specific kind of event structure and planning process, or, when you think about engagement and how you kind of bring people together to connect with one another.
Yeah, there's a multiple ways that we try to like basically do the like pre-convention experience before convention. One is like, for example, we use Slack. We use Slack actually for our membership at large, but then we'll also have like a specific channel about the convention. Oftentimes we'll see something like, oh, does anyone want a room with me? Or is anyone interested in this program? Does anyone want to sit with me? Like those are the types of like engagement we see on our Slack. We'll also see something like, oh, I do yoga. Like, does anyone want to like do a yoga session before all the programs starting? So like there's a little bit of a organic way, via digital, like organic way that like people are trying to find connection already, amongst our members. And I think we see it at least in our Slack. Like I'm trying to think of other like ways that we're like facilitating connection. But like, for example, even from like the sponsor viewpoint, we do try to make it so that the sponsors, if there were like key people or types of people that they want to facilitate conversations, because that's maybe their priorities for their hiring or their recruiting plan at the time, or maybe they're trying to like get a little bit more information of how to like run their ERGs, or like how to incorporate more diversity within their leadership. Like these are the types of like access that we give our sponsors to like make these connections like on site, as well as like running up into it. So maybe we're sharing an email, but we also say, and I'm sorry to keep blasting Guidebook, but we also say like, oh, you have access to any of the attendees right now on Guidebook. Like you can actually start this conversation now. You don't have to keep it on Guidebook, but like it's one way to like have a touch point that is like associated with a time and a space and an opportunity.
And do you see, because I think, sponsors are such a key revenue driver for events, and, it's definitely something that I speak to, not just associations, but a lot of event planners about it's that kind of around that notion of how do you make sure that, sponsors feel that they're getting ROI and getting good amount of engagement and throughout the event. Obviously Guidebook being one, but do you feel that sponsors do engage with Guidebook firstly? And then, do you have any specific ways that you try to focus in on sponsors and how you deliver value or support them getting value from the event?
Sure. So, I'll say this. I'm not exactly involved in the like pipeline coming in, but once
Mm,
we do something like in contract, I am a huge stickler for the fulfillment. Especially like as people are showing up, sponsors, excuse me, as sponsors are showing up to support our organization, I do think it's important for us to follow that contract to make sure that they are getting that ROI. So like to some degree, there is already there is a level of like what engagement they're expecting. But one thing I kind of wanted to share is like, what is that experience and how do you create that like clear ROI? I think it's one thing, for example, if a sponsor were to just come and like just try to like catch people at their like booth, like exhibit and like, like that randomness, RNG of it all. But I think actually what I try to do is like, what is the the protocol or like what are the again the front door to make like really like stronger connections. So for example, I know like this is something that we haven't implemented, but I think this will be a very strong benefit to our sponsors is the QR tracking attendee tracker.
Mm,
Like that particular function, I'm like really excited to implement for our sponsors, as well as our programming. I'll talk a little bit about this, but sponsors, for example, one of our structures that we have is called the Sponsor Academy, where a sponsor is allowed to program one of our convention rooms for 4 to 6 hours. And so,
mm.
like, who came into that room, like, and like being able to track it, like, whoever is that person in the front door, or maybe they have it in their room, say, like, I was in this session or in this, space. That is like that value of like instantaneous like capturing so that they can do the follow-ups after convention. Hopefully people are getting jobs out of this. Hopefully people are
Mm.
getting mentorship out of this, so that's where I think that like um like the sponsor fulfillment and the benefit is if our members feel good about that like sponsor. Like that's really what we're trying to cultivate, that relationship and that presence of these groups in our membership.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you're thinking about, yeah, utilizing attendee verification there to build more value and more. I think it's data, isn't it? Having data you can demonstrate to people, who was there, that really supports sponsors in terms of their follow-up, how they can engage with people, and think about their role and responsibilities at the event to kind of continue that discussion and what they do. So yeah, that's super exciting to hear you thinking about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other part of it too, I wanted to share about like the attendee tracker, like even like programmatically. Like we have I would say like programmatically as in like outside of the sponsor programming, but like member-based programming. Like I said, like it's helpful for us to see the quantity of what sessions are being asked for, but then it's also just as valuable to know which sessions were actually attended. So like
Mm.
having that feedback loop, like not only helps us in sponsors, but also helps us in programs so that we are building off of like what we would say is data, but like, like data is only something until it has narrative, right? So like that's where I think like we are able to understand like if our 1,500 attendees are basically, a tally each, where were all our tallies in any single snapshot. I think that would be like really interesting to see how we can like create better spaces or more spaces to facilitate this experience of our attendees.
Yeah, I love that. And kind of thinking about that content that you've just mentioned there, obviously you spoke about a sponsor maybe taking over 6 hours worth of programming and member-based programming. How do you find the balance in, delivering content that's going to be valuable for everyone involved in the event and ensuring that your structure and your lineup is good and relevant and for everyone?
For sure. I really appreciate this question. I do think this question kind of stems from the idea that sponsors are just like commercials at us, like the idea that like, oh, who can I use as an example without like overhyping? Anyways, I'll say this much for like sponsor programming. The good thing about our sponsor programming is that it is informed by our mission and our vision. These are people that are working with us to make it more accessible for our members as well as API journalists at large to be able to like interact with these newsrooms, these spaces, these foundations. So like luckily it is usually very very relevant. Like coming like the sponsors are coming with the heat, if you will, to like you really like try to make people understand that they are willing to work with API journalists. Historically that hasn't been the case. We've been an organization of 40 years. So that like there have been incremental and like movements in this spaces and in these and in this work and in this industry. But I think like especially during this time and I guess like any time, how are these partners really hearing what is happening in our nation, in our society, in our communities? And like I actually feel very strongly that sponsors are really doing that work for us too.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm kind of just sort of thinking as well about a few different points that are coming up and coming back to the members and the experience of the event. And, we've touched on content, we've touched on engagement. Do you typically have a core purpose at each of your event? And does it differ from event to event? Are some more content driven, really informed about learning, and are some more down this sort of engagement path and really about interacting and networking and building relationships? Or is it a kind of hybrid of both? Like, what would you say is the kind of core focus of those events?
Yeah, I'm going to try to pick this apart a little bit. Maybe you can,
Mm,
follow up a little bit more. But I think what you may be asking is like kind of what is our variety of events? Like, we do have our convention, which is like 1,500 person. But just recently, we also recently published a book called Intersections, which is a journalistic history of like AAPI journalists. So we host book events like book tours. Like we're trying to get people excited about this, and those events are like 15, 20 people. And like somewhere in the middle, like we just this past weekend, we actually just facilitated our AAPI correspondence brunch, which is in the same programming as the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So that's about a 300-person event there. So I guess like the way that I look at it and approach it is like, what kind of space are we making so that we can we can center ourselves, because no one else is going to do that. No one
mm,
else is going to celebrate it. And I think especially in this time, like I think we're seeing a lot of anti-narrative. So my hope and joy is to build spaces that allow for people to be themselves in
mm.
a space that talks about themselves. There's no like pretense of like, oh, do I have to be careful of who's listening, or like does this become a political conversation because I'm talking about my experience? Like, this is something that like at the foundational level, safety,
Mm.
and then like experience of self. From there, I think then we talk about opportunities, resources, trainings. Those are things that like if we are able to create that foundation of I would even say like community respect, then we can really start elevating into these targeted programmatic things.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I love that for many reasons. One being, when we come back to the heart of an event or essentially bringing people together, right? It's allowing people to be themselves and to be able to connect with others on a genuine and human level, kind of no matter what. And yeah, I think that's such an important pillar to build any event from. So yeah, I think that's really great in the way that you think and approach that and how important it is to the structure of all the events that you do. And before we move on to the kind of next section that I have in my head, I'm wondering, you're organizing a lot of events and a lot of components to it. And one question I see asked on a lot of these kind of conversations is just kind of like how big is your team that's working across these events? How many people are involved at delivering such a comprehensive event calendar?
Great question. So, as many people know, like nonprofit spaces are as lean, tight teams. So at least on our staff, currently we have 6 people on our staff, and mindful that of those people, they also have their own programs, their own projects, fundraising, so many different things that go into like the health and like the viability of a nonprofit. So sometimes I look at events and holding events. I do oversee most of our events as kind of the flower or the fruit of a plant that needs to first exist. And then, if we're able to approach and have the space and have the capacity and have the budget to like host these things, like those are they're ephemeral, they're quick, they happen so quickly. I mean, like a lot of work goes into it. And it is well supported by not only, of course, the staff, but we have a really great mechanism of like kind of like volunteers, like from the local chapter of whoever is like wherever we're having this event. Another thing that I want to like give props to is like, and I this is my first time having this experience, but like we have very, very active board members too, who like really like hold on these like key parts of our different events. So it's like it's helpful to um, rely on these different mechanisms, whether it be staff, the local chapter, their leadership or volunteers, membership as like inputs of like what is important, or and our partners too. We work with a lot of partners for our events. How are all these different inputs, and how basically as a producer, how am I digesting that, hearing what is like the key things and the key tenets of that, and then trying to find ways to implement it, either through experience, tools, or overall process.
Yeah, okay. No, that's great. And I just wanted to mention, I know that I think the chat isn't quite working. So if anyone does have any questions, and thanks Jay for notifying, do put them in the Q&A. There's a Q&A button that people can just pop stuff into, and we'll take those at the end. Now, I wanted to kind of move over to, I guess, the fact that, all event planners are facing some challenges at the moment. I think, you don't have to go far from even LinkedIn to kind of get a good sense of, the challenges that any industry and event planner does have coming against them. But I kind of want to look at some of the big challenges, that you're facing, whether that be the anti-DEI narratives, recruitment, funding, and just get a sense from you, like, it is a difficult space to be operating in. And yeah, how are you addressing these challenges within your events? And are they having an influence on the overall programming and the sort of strategic outlook that you're creating?
Thanks for asking those questions. I think I want to kind of balance it in a couple of ways. I'd like to lead with that AAJA is very much intact. Like we are, again, a 440-year-old organization. So to some degree, no matter what is going around, like programmatically or like even strategically, I think there's an integrity that we'll hold on to. It may not look like events. We may not get the budget for it, but at the very base level, like the 2000 x some, journalists that are part of our membership, like, we're still trying to hold that together. Hold our space in mainstream media, our space in, newsrooms, our space in to be able to be storytellers. I don't think there's ever going to be a situation where we'd stop telling stories. I think maybe I'm a little bit delusional with like how nonprofits work, and maybe how this administration is like really like taking, doing efforts to make it hard for organizations like ours. I guess the way that like we would approach it is like really just seeing like what is the opportunity still. Both with our like long running partners, like we do hear it from them, like, hey, like we can't commit X thousands more. We can't be your X sponsor because of these like reasons that we're still figuring out too. And I think that was the most surprising, at least with my sponsors, like hearing that language is like they're trying to figure it out too. Although it may not be the same amount of money in, like it's not a validation of their view of us. It's a reaction to like trying not to, I don't know. Yeah. Anyways. And then, I think like other challenges that I think we see with events is like people coming out to it, like with like the current like state of the economy, the current state of like the industry, like in journalists, like we do see like people getting laid off, but interestingly enough, a counter to that is that people also see that as an opportunity. Like now more than ever, do I need to connect with people who I know will see me and help me and resource me and support me as I navigate this difficult time. So, like every action has a reaction kind of experience, at this time. And, I think that is a difficult point in the overall event producing process is what is the shake of the dice today or this year? What are the different things I have to be interested in and understanding of so that I can make space for hopefully like an experience that will kind of reground them into like the work that we're doing. I guess like, for example, like we'll never not have a first timers kickoff, for convention, because we want to make sure that like, how to access any of the stuff, this is where, there are things that there will not be changed just because of the finances of it all, or what narratives there are outside of this, outside of our, community. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a sticky one to kind of go through.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware it's a challenging question and conversation to have, right? I mean, because everyone's going to be experiencing it differently, first and foremost. I mean, some, well, even just from a financial and from the challenges that, like you talked about, your sponsors and your partners, right? Not every partner is going to feel the same situation in the same way. And I'm curious, you said something there around now is a great time to go to events, right? It's a time to connect with people and to, um, if you're needing to find new business or new career opportunities or whatever it is, it's such a good time to be out there meeting with people and actually stepping away from the online discussion that can feel quite hard and heated. And do you change the way in which you communicate your events in and around times like this? I think typically in a boom time, we communicate events and market events in a certain way, and maybe in challenging times we have to think about that differently. Is that something that you're considering at the moment or have considered previously?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the easiest way for me to answer this is like how we theme our conventions. We have like a little bit of a formula for this. It's like active verb participle noun, so for example, like this year is forging our legacies, navigating the future. I'm gonna say this again: forging our legacies and navigating the future. So, like thematically, there is this thing that like we try to inject into our programming and how people are interacting with our convention. I don't know if necessarily all 1,500 attendees are like, oh wow, the theme this year really gets me, like. But I think like at least the way that staff, we call it, HQ, our board members, like even like key members or leaders, like we do think about like how we are talking about convention, what these things that we were going to be like touching on, like not only during our programming, but also like during our, what I call marquee events. This is the type of like, I definitely love the word just messaging of it all is like, like how does any of these themes inform these emails that get sent out, our posts that we like get? So like it's not supposed to just be register now, it's to be like register now so that you can be part of our community as we do XYZ. Like that's like it may not always be said, but I think that's always like the underlying tone of how we should like yeah, get people to be excited or like, market this event around. Yeah, I think that's how I could see it most closely.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm gonna feed in a question from Jay, just because it fits right now. But he just asked, do you ever use location-based marketing to promote your events?
Hmm. Thank you for the question. At this point, no, we actually don't. We have a pretty like healthy cycle right now of like our members, our ecosystem, our sponsors is our and ends up being our attendees. So I think what you probably are asking, like, do we do like Facebook ads, Instagram ads, ads that are like that you can choose like location, especially like you can even choose like different other metrics or sorry, not metrics, demographics to be able to like get it in front of a certain person. I do see value in that. I am not the comms person nor like the person to be able to say like, yes, let's run ads. But I could see how that could be valuable. But I think at the very, very baseline, we always try to lead with like become a member first. Make sure that you want to like, like that you're getting like the resources out of this. And then from there, convention is also discounted if you're a member first. So I think that's where we kind of like lead more so with our marketing to have like more members first.
Nice. We have a great comment from Ariel Shapiro who just mentioned, I think I know you from college. I've added you on LinkedIn. So there you go. Afterwards, you can see if you both know each other from college. I think that's pretty cool. If so, I know we're coming towards the end, but I also just wanted to, we've touched on Guidebook a couple of times, but I want to think of technology more as a whole and you know, when you look at your technology strategy or the technology that you implement, especially around events, have you had any kind of unexpected or rewarding outcomes utilizing technology when you think about engagement at your events, whether that be from members or sponsors or both? Like, how are you, planning to adopt and implement technology?
Yeah, I think one thing that we saw a lot of engagement around was the leaderboard from Guidebook. I think that was like one of our first times to be able to be like, how can we get people like interacting with the app so that they are familiar with it before they get on site? Like again, like we do try to make it like ourselves a resource to like show people on site like how to use Guidebook, all of that, but also like the more that people can do it beforehand and the more that people have proficiency around it, then they're just going to be like super users and like if anything be champions to like using it as well. So I know like last year for like our leadership board, like we had someone who was like starting like right when it got released, was doing so many of these points like even before getting on site, blew everyone out of the water. And like so we do gamify that experience a little bit. We did give them like some swag and like prizes for their activities. But I think that's like one way, like, how can we make interacting first with the app both informative, but also a potential for connection before the convention. So that's one. Other tools, I think, like I mentioned earlier, like I'm really, really interested in implementing the attendee checking process into our different spaces. It's going to, I think, like knowing kind of like what is of interest by sheer numbers of attendance allows us to then create bigger spaces, more spaces for that programming or that session, whatever it may be. So I think that's another way that with tools. But also, I kind of wanted to step back from the actual like in-person like experience and like tools going into the convention. How do we create tools that are supportive for the planners, the coordinators, the producers, the partners? So the way I approach it is that I actually come from like a lean startup background. I actually like try to hear first about the pain points from like what has been the experience of for example, our convention programming committee leads. I'm like, what worked, what didn't work? Like be candid because I want things to work and for you, and I said this earlier about like, the dice roll of like, we don't know what the situation is. These people also change year to year. So styles are different. Access is different. Time zones are different, so like these are the types of things that like really inform like, okay, how can I at least try to make a process or a tool? I call them workspaces so that like your work is easier. And if it's not easier, and then there's at least a mechanism for us to change things. And like I would say I'm a huge like super user for like Google Docs, like lots of spreadsheets, lots of documents, like program documents, run of shows, all of those things. Like I try to make them at least templatized to some degree so that how they enter into these different spaces, they can be morphed into their needs.
Yeah, no, that's that's great. We have another question, and kind of just coming back to the gamification piece. And just can you talk more about gamifying that usage? Like what data points were collected and measured?
Sure. So, I guess I will like dumb down gamification around the idea of like when someone does an action, do they get incentives? Right. So the way that, we didn't do much different from what Guidebook already had laid out as a template of like how people can get points for this, like what it's called leaderboard.
Yeah.
So those points were like, for example, reaching out to another attendee, signing up for a session, looking at like a sponsor page. Like there are like different ways, and like it's already preset inside of Guidebook, so you just kind of select it and decide how many points there are. And so when people then like see that it's available, we made this this leaderboard, like we launched it, if you will. Then like people started reaching out to people. People started doing these things, and then the leaderboard shows, like X thousands of points from Janelle because she's just been like connecting with people. Like, yeah, I'm connecting because I'm trying to get these points. I say go girl. But but I guess what you're asking here around, let's see here. I'm just making sure that I'm answering the question, like gamification and like the data points. Like I suppose when we look at the data points of like what type of people want to interact that way, Like for example, like the leaderboard didn't have 1,500 people. I think maybe 100. I'm not too sure, but like, like, okay, cool. Like this is exciting for this set of people, and they have their own thing and they got an experience out of it. Like, oh, I made the leaderboard. So like, although it may not be as like a goal of like, oh, do they feel represented in media? Like, it's like, oh, they had a good experience at convention. They were able to make connections. And so hopefully this launches into a potential mentoring opportunity, a potential job opportunity, resources, connection, change of minds, so that's where I think gamification can actually lead to other things.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. And just to kind of build on that from a guidebook perspective, just with the tool, I mean, one, it's in people's guide, so they can just turn it on and you decide how many points you want to make for each different bit. And there's basically a long list and you can toggle on and off what you do and don't want to use from a point scoring perspective. So yeah, if you can just try it, you can, like you said, not everyone's going to engage with it, but for those people that do, they might have a really good time. They might connect with more people than they would usually at your event or anything like that, or give feedback when they might not have otherwise. And I do think, one of the core thinkings behind, guidebook and gamification is that you're building habits. You're bringing people into the guide more frequently. And as they're trying to score points, what they're doing is they're exploring the guide that you built. So although not every component of your guide gives people access to point scoring, they might actually find information they otherwise wouldn't have because they're actively trying to play a game. But all of a sudden they're engaging with more resources. They might find, I don't know, it could be PDFs, it could be sponsors, it could be unique content or people that they might not have otherwise found. So from our side, that's what we wanted gamification to deliver, is to allow people to spend more time in the guide, to hopefully find all of the work and effort that the guide builder has put into it and explore it properly. So yeah, that was just a little bit more, and I can always share more on leaderboard if anyone ever wants to know about it. But I kind of just, I know we're coming to the end, and I just wanted to kind of ask one final question, and really just from your experience, of which you have a lot, not just in your current role, but in previous roles as well that you've alluded to and mentioned. What advice would you give to event planners, associations, whoever might be listening, just in terms of like how to kind of foster community and engagement and really drive that forward, in their kind of event plans for this year?
Thank you for that question. I think, yeah, like you mentioned, I've had, before joining this role, I've had 8 years of my own event production company. And then in these past 2 years, or I would actually say in this past 5 years, I've really just been focusing on like taking these skill sets and like really supporting a organization, like communities that I want to see do well in this world. So, I think one advice I would give first is, understanding like your lens as you approach the work. I think some people oftentimes can get lost in the events need to be successful because of how many attendees and how much money you raised. But what gets lost around that is like, what's the experience and like what's the agreement of like everyone in that space. So at least the way that like I would advise is to ask questions. Ask questions of your attendees, previous attendees, potential attendees, people who have stakes in this work. Maybe it's your board members, maybe it's leaders of your associations. They are in it. They are experiencing why they need support or why we like do this work. So they can also tell you like what can be important for them, for their committees, for their chapter. Like they also can talk about like what they foresee in like the upcoming future around how they are as an individual or their newsroom is working towards. And those are the types of things, like if you can have real conversations around this, you can also have real solutions, resources at your convention too. So those types of conversations, I started off in the design thinking process. Like really, you need to center people around what you're doing. Like I think, for example, You guys can call me out on this, but like I would love to always be a registration manager. Like, like if I was not like a director of this or a producer of this, like I like love to be a registration person because that is a first point of someone's experience. So I kind of like in a way like think about my whole event process is like how am I being a registration manager for general information as we go into the production of it all. So yeah, the advice is ask questions, be prepared as you can, prepare to be flexible. And as long as you know what the goals are and you can stick to them, you're probably gonna act perfectly fine and perfectly great. So lean into those goals and lean into like your team to like hold you in that space as well.
I love that. That's such a great way to bring our chat today to an end. So firstly, just want to say thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today. And thank you to everyone for joining and for the people that asked questions. We really appreciate it. But yeah, I'm super excited to see what you do this year with your events and everything else and look forward to catching up later in the year. But again, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you to Guidebook.